somewhat different order than I intended to, because I want to be sure and get to this important stuff. But it would be great if at some point you read the passages in the handout. Look, I'm going to talk more about abstract entities than about the grammar and existence, because in that early piece, the first half of it, sort of as you'll see from the outline here, I'll mention in passing, there is no section 3 in that essay. He just was there once and it disappeared, or did he just misnumber them? I don't know. It's an incredibly fine-grained debate with Geach, who is as fussy about the use of ordinary language as Sellars is. But as far as I can see, Sellars is just right there. Anyway, that's a discussion worth looking at. But he sets out very clearly these two problems in the second half of that essay. The translation problem, I put those passages in the handout, but here's the quick, just slightly more detailed than what I said before. If you have a statement like triangularity is a property, that's a proper classifying context, the one where he thinks, yeah, these are the ones that are really serious, where there are terms introduced, names introduced, and sortal terms that they fall under. So we're introducing triangularity, and property is the kind of thing that or a property is fine, or shape is a sortal that it falls under. So we can translate that into German. Dreieckigkeit ist eine Eigenschaft. That's okay. But now, if we go metalinguistic and we say, as Carnap does, well, what you're really saying is triangular is a predicate. That's the perspicuous translation of triangularity is a predicate. Well, when we translate that, do we get triangular ist ein Prädikat? Or do we get dreieckig ist ein Prädikat? When we translate it, those don't mean the same thing. They're talking about different words. And it's neither one of them is saying the same thing as the full English or German expression there. And then modally, he considers someone who says triangularity is a property, but no one speaks English, or says that in German. And again, it seems that triangularity as a property would not have its truth value affected by those kind of actual circumstances. But in Grammar and Existence, he really waves his hands at the solutions. He doesn't have them. He hasn't introduced all the machinery that he will in the abstract entities paper, which is the fullest treatment of it. But what I want to talk about is his solution, his response to the other complaint, the complaint that at most you're going to be moving the bump in the rug around. You're still going to have to acknowledge universals, even if you drive them into the language and say these are linguistic universals. Because he makes a very interesting distinction to begin with. He wants to say, all the this is in the handout, this is from 166. His view requires us to hold that not all ones over against manys are universals, i.e. qualities, relations, sorts, kinds, or classes. And consequently, to conclude that the problem of the one and the many is broader than the problem of universals. And he's not going to claim to solve the problem of one and many. He's going to have ones and manys, but he's going to say, but I don't have particulars and universals. And this, I think, is a strategy of distinguishing two grades of involvement in abstraction. He's saying there's some kinds of nominalization that involve producing terms that refer to manys that are related to abstraction, but don't produce abstract terms of the kind that I claim don't refer to anything in the real world. Like Carnap, Sellars is an ontological nominalist because he's a semantic nominalist. That is, he has the view that there's nothing in the world that can't be referred to by singular terms, that isn't properly referred to by singular terms. Any what's expressed by predicates and verbs isn't real in the same sense in which the things that have the predicates and are referred to by the nouns engaged in the activities expressed by the verbs are. So as I think the underlying view, the nominalism, is that what there really is what can be named. But the trouble is there's all these spurious names around. Names like triangularity, he's saying, they're not real names. You can sort of tell that they're not because you already know how to do everything you need to know how to do to introduce the pseudo-name triangularity if you can just use the predicate is triangular. Now you're going to introduce it by an abstraction-like process. But the fact that in order to introduce this new term, triangularity, you don't need to consult the world any more than you already had to consult it in order to use is triangular. There's nothing more about the world you need to find out in order to talk triangularity talk. There's no further feature of the world, triangularity, as opposed to the things that are triangular, that you're talking about with it. That talk is elaborated from your use of the adjective, and it's, as it were, just some more words that are added, not any more sort of descriptive commitments or epistemological things. But then we have to ask, what's the difference between the genuine names, the ones that you're going to say pick something out in the world, and the rest of them? The ones that are introduced by some kind of nominalization of other parts of speech and are second class. And here's the key move that he's making that I think it can be hard to see and hard to see him making the move and sort of hard to see what the move is that he's making. There's another thing that Frege taught us in the Grundlagen, which is the distinction between merely attributive predicates and common nouns. That is the difference between is red and is triangular on the one hand and is a dog on the other hand. And the difference, as Frege taught us to think about it, is that merely attributive predicates have got criteria of application. If you want to say there's truth conditions, but there's circumstances under which it's appropriate to apply them, call something red or call it triangular. And Sellars would add, there's also consequences of application downstream, what follows inferentially from those circumstances of application applying. And that's all true of dog as well as red or triangular too. It's got circumstances and consequences of appropriate application, but it's got something more. It's got criteria of identity and individuation. That is, the question, but is this the same dog as that, has applicability. And for triangular, there isn't anything like that. And for red, there is only because it's ambiguous. We can ask, is it the same red? Meaning, is it the same shade of red? But that's because we make more distinctions in the shapes, grammatically in the shapes, than we do in the colors. So better to stick with the shape terms. Frege's point is there's predicates that just have criteria of application, and then there's predicates that have criteria of application and criteria of identity and individuation. We can ask whether it's the same K or not. Now, I say Frege introduced this. I mean, it's not like people hadn't been perfectly well aware of this before, and indeed, sort of at the beginning of metaphysics, Aristotle starts off saying, look, the common nouns are the important things, not just the predicables that can go with them. And that's something that basically got lost in first order logic in what Sellars calls PMEs, the language of Principia. You don't get this distinction. Sellars thinks there's nothing in the world that corresponds to mere attributive predicates. You're misunderstanding the grammar to think that they pick something out in the world, just a thing of a different kind, a property. That's a confusion for him. Common nouns, though, are a way of talking about what there really is. There really are dogs. There isn't a property of doghood, however. Again, that would be to reify the conditions of application. But the common noun is okay, nominalistically. It is a noun. You're using it to refer to dogs. Now, dog doesn't pick out individual dogs. It's a many, not a one. Fido picks out one dog. But dog is a way of referring to, well, all the dogs he's thinking, a many, but it doesn't do it by abstraction. And so he's going to say, thinking that there is something triangularity is reifying a universal. That term, triangularity, is not a noun that carries with it reference to reality in the narrow sense. Dog does. Dog is okay, triangularity is not. Doghood is not okay. So he's going to see gradations corresponding to different kinds of nominalization. And he's going to allow the common nouns, but not the merely attributive predicates. So the example he starts with is a distributive singular term. This is the first sort of bit of conceptual machinery he introduces. He says, we can talk about the lion. That's a distributive singular term. We can say, the lion is tawny. The lion is a carnivore, we can say. He says, that's okay, distributive singular term. All you need to know to use that term is how to talk about individual lions, and the lion is tawny is true, just in case the inference from Leo's a lion to Leo is tawny is a good one, no matter who Leo is. Talk about the lion is a way of talking about all the lions. It's a singular term, but its reference is really to the individual lions. It just refers to all of them distributively. It's a good nominalization. It's a nominalization that doesn't pretend to talk about something that isn't really there. His really favorite example of this is Anglophile that he was. The pub is the poor man's club. Yeah.
Is this a kind of plural quantification then, in a way?
Yeah. So it's a kind of nominalization of a common noun. And it gives us a way of talking about all the things that the common noun is true of. That's what's analogous to the plural quantification. But it's not a common noun. It's a name or a singular term better, the lion. And we can apply predicates to it, is tawny.
Is there a way of addressing issues with generics? So like, I understand the idea of a good inference when the inference is like, oh, it's a lion, so it must be tawny, or it's a lion, so it must be a carnivore. But then there seem to be these like infelicitous inferences from like, it's a bird, so it migrates, or it's a bird, so it flies.
Well, I mean, let me use some slightly different examples. I mean, the lion is quadrupedal, for instance, but there are three-legged lions, unfortunate in one way or another, though they may be. So for sort of natural kinds like that, we wouldn't want to just equate it with the universal quantifier. So he says, well, we should use something like Aristotle's generally, or for the most part. here. It's still a way of talking about lions. You know, the individual lions, but the truth conditions don't require the exceptionalist truth of the universal quantifier. Now we could he would be perfectly amenable to an account like Thompson's of, you know, pine trees thrive in sandy soil, say, the pine tree thrives in sandy soil as a distributive singular term, with sort of all the things that go with the logic of, you know, sort of talking about living things in those circumstances. That isn't where Sellars' discussion goes, but he mentions sort of cases like this, but doesn't give us an account. But as I say, I think he'd be entirely on board with the Thomsonian account. What he does look at is the pawn. When we say the pawn can move one space, say, or the bishop moves on a diagonal. And this case is different for him because the generalization that underlines it is a normative one. So it's got an implicit according to the rules of chess, or insofar as it's moving appropriately given the rules of chess. And he wants to say that when we start talking about metalinguistic distributive singular terms, which is the kind of thing that dot-quoted expressions are, they're going to be like the pawn, not like the lion. The lion is not a metalinguistic distributive singular term. The pawn is not a metalinguistic distributed singular term. But the dot lion is. It's a metalinguistic distributive singular term that refers to uses of the term lion in any language in the same way that lion refers to Leo. In the same way that the lion refers to Leo is made true by sort of what's true of Leo and Leona and all the other lions. So, I'm backing up slightly. Sellars takes common nouns to be an essential part of the practice of naming in a way that predicates aren't. They aren't themselves names, but the things you name have to be picked out by common nouns because they've got to have associated criteria of identity and individuation with them. Otherwise, you don't know whether you're naming. If I to use one of Frege's examples, if I throw the deck of cards down there and say, I name that Charlie, well, am I naming the deck of cards? Or maybe I'm only naming the red cards in it, or maybe only the hearts in it, or maybe all of the twos. If you don't give a common noun, you haven't successfully named some object. You've got to give it an individuating sortal. Now I should say there is a by now vast literature on the question of just what role common nouns play in naming and quantification. Anil Gupta's dissertation, published as his book, The Logic of Common Nouns, is one of the classic treatments of this. Geach, who is a player in all of these discussions, is notorious for claiming that because naming is relative to is sortal relative, as he learned from Frege, so is identity. And in the sort of example that Gupta will talk about in his book, I can be identical with the millionth passenger that American Airlines flew last year as a passenger. Sorry, we'll individuate differently as a passenger, as a person. So, sorry, I screwed up the example. So, when I flew to Chicago and then flew back, I was the same person on both trips, but I was counted as a different passenger. When they count passengers, they count them differently. The criteria of identity and individuation are different than they are for persons. One way to think about the airlines is they don't care about people, they only care about passengers. So Geach says you can't just ask whether A is identical to B. You need to subscript the identity with a common noun. Same person, yes, but not same passenger. Now, to a first approximation, Geach is the only human being who has ever been convinced by this argument, but exactly how to accommodate the data is a really difficult problem. And as I said, Gupta has a fabulous story about it. And we probably won't get to my fabulous story about this, but it's in the second half of the Sellars book, of my Sellars book. But what is clear is that when you name something, in order to pick out a particular, it's not enough to give criteria of application. They've got to be associated criteria of identity and individuation. When will it be the same thing as the one that you picked out? And those are codified in common nouns. So Sellars says, look, we nominalists who think all there is what can be named don't have a problem with many's in the form of common nouns. Not just Leo, but the lion is okay with us. The lion is a good nominalization of a common noun. That's okay. And he wants to contrast that with a nominalization of essentially any other part of speech, which he's going to object to. Now, I'm going to say this in passing, and it's incredible inside baseball as far as Sellars is concerned, but late in life, Sellars propounded a process ontology and said, look, what there really is, of course it's just particulars, but they're processes, not sort of objects, the way we would think about it. And yeah, there's events too, they're limiting cases of processes, sort of really short ones. At that point, as far as I can see, he's accepting gerundive nominalizations. There are runnings, and there are abstractings. There are these doings. Well, those are, gerunds are nouns formed from verbs, and that's what singular terms that refer to processes are. But he doesn't, in his treatment of process ontology, revisit the question of why these nominalizations of verbs now are okay. He thought they weren't when he was writing this. So, I mean, since I almost literally could not care less about the process ontology, even I'm not much engaged with whether there's a tension in his views there. So I mention this only to put it to one side, that it's a question what he would have said, because what his nominalism turns on here is this decidedly inegalitarian attitude towards different kinds of nominalizations. That things that are already nouns are okay. So common nouns, not just singular terms, and even singular terms that are nominalizations of common nouns are okay. But nominalizations of adjectives or verbs are not okay. Those are pseudo terms with a misleading grammar that we have to see through, and he's going to give us the real grammar for them. Terms introduced by abstraction don't refer to anything in the world. That's I say it's an inappropriate nominalization. That he doesn't think there's anything wrong with abstraction. It's just misleading. It's not perspicuous because you're producing terms that purport to refer to particulars, just particulars like triangularity, and they don't. And you're introducing then common nouns like property or shape that that purport to identify and individuate things of these abstract kinds, and they don't. That's not the way they're functioning at all. Now I can say very briefly, if you look at the picture of grammar and existence, Geach says there's something that both Tim and Tom are, tall. Well, that's a property, so there are properties. And what Sellars is going to say is nothing about what entitles us to say there is something that Tim and Tom both are, tall, entitles us to introduce a common noun that applies to those things. So all that says is the something is tall. They're both tall. That's what we can say. But we would only be doing something that the nominalist would object to if what we introduced had common nouns going with it. And for that, having the adjective, the predicate, isn't enough. You've got to have a nominalization of the predicate. And he's saying Geach just slides between these. And basically, Frege, when he's saying there is something predicates stand for, same thing, that it's true that both the scalene and the equilateral are triangles, but unless you nominalize that, that doesn't let us introduce common nouns that would apply to what is true of both of them. So that's basically ground clearing that he does there. The things that are threatening are the nominalizations that come with criteria of identity and individuation codified in common nouns. And it's just some of them are bogus and others of them are not. And I think, at least for me to work up any enthusiasm about the question, well, are some of these real and in the world and others not? I don't understand that question. But to explore the difference between the commitments you're undertaking in using some of these expressions and in using the others, and saying, look, there are these different grades of commitment that go along with different kinds of nominalization. And let's look at the different ways in which the lion works and triangularity works, because they work differently. So from my point of view, making the invidious metaphysical claim, and that difference in function corresponds to the one picking out something or representing or describing something real, and the other is merely a pseudo-description, pseudo-representation. That's the part I don't understand. But these different grades of sort of abstractive commitment, that there are these different grades, that's real and that's important. So he says things like, this is from 166, and this is in the handout. To refer to such a one, we need a singular term other than the singular terms by which we refer to individual pawns, and yet which do not refer to a universal of which they're instances. So he's claiming dog and the dog. Well, the dog is what we're looking for. It's a singular term other than singular terms like Fido and that dog. The dog is a distributive singular term, and yet which does not refer to a universal of which there are instances, because those universals formed by abstraction going from his triangular to triangularity, that's what he objects to. So he's got this wider notion of unity in diversity, which the pawn, the lion, are instances of, and then this narrower class of terms that are introduced by abstraction corresponding to nominalizing other parts of speech than nouns. And I think he's giving us a very careful and fine-grained analysis of the difference between the behavior of these different kinds of nominalizations. And I at least find it interesting that he thinks this is what the problem of universals always was about. Okay, but important to him is you can understand the use of the lion or the pawn without having to know how to do anything you didn't already have to know how to do in order to use the common noun lion or pawn. So extended quote. If therefore we can understand the relation of the lion, a one, to lions, many, without construing the lion as a universal of which lions are instances, rather we understand it as a distributive singular term, that's the technical term he's introducing for it, and if the looked-for singular term pertaining to pawns can be construed by analogy with the lion, indeed as the pawn, then we would be in a position to understand how the pawn could be a one as against a many without being a universal of which pawns are instances. So, if we could reduce or explain the sort of respects of similarity that redness and triangularity are about, by reducing them to ones in many in the language that word to words the way the pawn is, then we wouldn't have just moved the bump in the rug around. We wouldn't have violated our nominalist principles. This, in turn, would enable a distinction between a generic sense of abstract entity in which the lion and the pawn, as well as triangularity, and that 2 + 2 = 4, would be abstract entities as being ones over and against manys, and a narrower sense of abstract entity in which qualities, relations, sorts, classes, propositions, and the like are abstract entities, but of these only a proper subset, universals but not propositions, for example, would be ones as over and against instances or members. This subset would include the kind lion, and the class of pawns, which must not be confused with the lion and the pawn. So, so the main point is, reiterating that we've got the larger class of ones and many, of which the lion is a paradigm, and that's different, a fundamentally different kind of nominalization from the way in which triangularity is a nominalization of is triangular. He's going to see some of these common nouns as normatively articulated. Pawn is and lion isn't. And in the next iteration of his argument, he's going to look at ones in many that are classifying linguistic items, and so are metalinguistic in the sense he's after. And that's what he's introducing the dot quotes to do. So let me say something about the dot quotes. People often talk as though dot, lion, dot, when Sellars is using it, is a name for the conceptual or inferential role that lion plays. And he gives aid and comfort to that by the way he talks sometimes. So we can say things like, on the other side of the Rhine, rot is a dot red. And what we're committing ourselves to by saying that is that rot plays the same role in German that red plays in English. Now, those are, as it were, the truth conditions for the dot quoted expression. But he's very clear here, and it's very important that dot red is not a name of that conceptual role or inferential role that they share. That would be an abstract object, as he's thinking about it, where the plays the same role as relation is the equivalence relation, and we rise up to the abstraction and say the inferential role of rot is the same as the inferential role of red, in the way we say the direction of line A is the same as the direction of line B. We'd be introducing inferential roles as abstract objects. That's not playing fair by the nominalist principles. What we introduce instead is a distributive singular term that is formed from a common noun that applies to different linguistic expressions, just in case they play the same inferential role. Is that clear? So, lion, the common noun, is okay in a way that triangularity isn't. We can form the lion, and that's still okay. Distributive singular term, not an abstract object. Banana. He's using, he's talking this way. We can introduce pawn where the common noun is normatively articulated, a matter of being properly assessed according to rules, rulish. We can introduce dot red as a metalinguistic distributive singular term. So it's to be like the lion. It's to stand in the same relation to individual terms like red and rot as the lion stands to Leo and Leona. And that, so that's going to handle the worry that metalinguistic nominalism is going to be half-hearted because it's just moving the universals into the language. He's saying, no, these aren't universals. Universals are the things you refer to by abstraction, by terms you've introduced by abstraction. And I'm not introducing these by abstraction. I'm introducing them by this process of forming distributive singular terms, which is not in general a metalinguistic operation. I mean, it's a linguistic operation, but the lion is not a metalinguistic distributive singular term, but dot lion is. Now he's still got the translation and counterfactual worry, but dot quotes are the response to that too, because he says we have they're formed using what he calls an illustrating sign design principle. And that is that the red inside dot red is used, not mentioned. Inside real quote marks, it's only mentioned. We're just referring to this word. And you don't need to understand the word red in order to use the expression quote red. I can use Turkish terms in quotes and talk about, that one has that funny C with the cedilla under it, doesn't it? I don't understand what it is, but I can refer to this expression just fine. But to understand the expression quote rot is dot red, I have to understand the expression red that's in there, because the distributive singular term is formed picking out the common noun, picking out the things it does by giving me an illustration of an expression that plays that role in my language. It's the illustrative singular term. And so if I were to translate the expression, let me shift it, rouge is a dot red into German, it would be rouge ist eine dot rot, where you don't translate what goes in the real quotes because it's only mentioned, but in forming a dot quoted distributive singular term, one is using the dot quoted expression. One is just using it in this peculiar idiosyncratic way that he's describing. One is using it to illustrate, one is using it illustratively, that is to display an expression which in the language you're using plays the inferential role, which is what is shared by all the things the distributive singular term applies to. Now we should say that without using the substantive, the inferential role, that stands in the relation same, plays the same role as. So I feel I'm not doing justice to the sort of clarity of this notion. It's complicated, but it's crystal clear. And he's constructed this notion of metalinguistic distributive singular terms in such a way that he can respond to these, he can evade the two objections from translation and from counterfactuals, because he thinks the dot red would still exist even if nobody spoke English. He can process that counterfactual. I can, in English, say things like, well, what if no one had ever spoken English? And that's perfectly intelligibly said in English, and I'm considering a genuine counterfactual in that way. And he thinks the same thing is true of these distributive singular terms. So the counterfactuals come out right. I mean, they're an argument is called for that that I'm only gesturing at. So I hope I've given some idea of how these two technical notions, distributive singular terms and dot quotes, are crafted to let him have a nominalism where it seems like it's just a metalinguistic nominalism, where it looked like it was just impossible, where even in Grammar and Existence, he'd sort of seen there was room for it, but he didn't see how to do it. But he figured it out in this next year. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I mean, so I understand how the dot quotes help sort of one modal worry. So if English hadn't been spoken, you could still say sort of truly triangularity is a property or whatever, and have an account of what one's saying and what one's doing and saying that. But I mean, I'm wondering, and maybe I missed some place where Sellars talks about this, but it seems true to say, if human beings hadn't existed, triangularity would be a property or something like that. And I'm wondering if he has some account of how the sort of modal notions are working when we say things like that.
So he does say some things in AE here about it, but he doesn't drill as far down as we would like him to. I mean, the phenomenon he's going to appeal to is the one that the great modal logician Abraham Lincoln invokes when he asked the question, if we all agreed to call a tail a leg, how many legs would horses have? And gave the answer, they'd still have 4, because you can't change how many legs a horse has by talking differently. Now I take it this is a fundamental insight into the relation between the use language in which you formulate counterfactuals and the counterfactual situations that you are contemplating, are describing in that language. Now I will say parenthetically, two-dimensional modal logic is attempting to make sense of the other answer, of the sense in which no, then horses would have 5 legs, and maybe they make a coherent case, but anyway, that's the thought that he's appealing to. That's the kind of thing he says to say. No. Dot is triangular would be a predicate even if no one had ever spoken any language. So, I mean, I think we're going to have to give him some help along that, but he says enough to sort of give us pieces for it. Okay. Well, look. Do at least irradiate your retina with all the passages that are in this handout, and it'd be a really good thing to read the naming and saying essay. You should be sort of have the background to be able to nod along with a lot of it and say, yes, we have this, but there are some new things put on the table, and that's the essay that really bears on the scientific realism and why in the world one would think that the only things that are real are the things you can name, which is behind the nominalism and his scientific naturalism in the extreme sense.